We're going to start the second segment of today's session. Our second speaker is Siva. Siva and I worked at HSBC for a number of years. Siva is currently the head of security and fraud risk for commercial banking channels. He started off as a developer and has 18 years of experience in the security industry. He's been a pentester, PCI QSA, and he's currently responsible for protecting mission-critical banking applications against cyber and fraud attacks. I know his job is really difficult. I've been there with him. So let's give a big round of applause. And
yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, first I'll already give a little bit of a background of my background actually. So I'll just start expand a little bit on that, and then we'll go into the topic. So I, as you said, started off as a developer. I developed client-server applications, like if you still remember it. And I then moved on to web applications, and then I found that I was actually even better at breaking things, and I moved into security testing, like testing and then security testing, and that went into penetration testing, I started a company as well, co-founded a company in California, just doing security consulting, primarily pen testing, web application security testing, and PCI consulting as well, over time. Did a lot of PCI and PA-DSS, payment card industry, the PCI DSS standard, as well as the payment applications, data security standard. And then I had enough of travel, like doing consulting work, I decided I wanted to stay in one place, and I joined the company. So now I just want to mention something here. So this is not an officially my employer approved talk. So I'm going to basically say employer. You can easily find out who my employer is. It's not like a huge mystery. He's already mentioned it. But I'm going to use some of the context, but it's also going to be stuff that I've learned all around. Not just at this location. And I'm going to keep it neutral, but I just wanted to, give that context, I'm not going to specifically mention, the employer, I'm not supposed to, right? Okay, so, the topic is, managing convenience security. So one of the things that, you'll normally see is the more, it's a function, right? So, more security means usually less functionality, or at least more friction. You are going to end up with lots of challenges, and then people keep or you tighten it so much that it's unusable. The only secure application or secure anything is basically if you don't build it at all, right? So you don't have it, then it's the best. You don't have any attacks on it because it doesn't exist. So one of the things that we are going to talk about, or rather the primary thing that we are going to be talking about with a lot of other associated things, would be how do you manage how do you reduce friction for users, but at the same time increase your security view into and also provide a secure application or a service. So I've already covered this. Pretty much I manage currently cybersecurity and fraud risk for commercial bank channels. So this is going to form the basis for what we are going to talk about. So the lens that I'm going to be talking about from is going to be based on commercial banking channel. And commercial bank channel is different from when you go into a website, or when you go to a bank and then open an account. That's going to be retail. So the terminology that we'll be using: commercial banking, corporate banking, and retail. Retail will be what you personally would be using. Commercial banking would be what companies would be using. So company can, and when we talk about somewhere I have something somewhere here versus customer versus user. So when I say customer, it's basically, let's say, a company, let's say Ping Identity, because we are here. Ping Identity would be a customer, and then the users would be the users that Ping identifies as authorized to use the application. So there's a distinction. When you do talk about retail banking, there is not that distinction. Is your customer is your user, and that is a very significant difference. That we will see why as we go along. There are lots of aspects of this, that will actually affect us. Because the primary reason is the masters that we serve are actually not the users. Like we serve, so corporates typically have more security controls. They have their own security shop inside, and they require, they have policies, procedures, they have, standards that everybody needs to meet. Unlike a retail customer, like they don't really have any of these things. So, they are, and retail customers typically are more, tend more towards ease of use. Versus, even though in our case users want ease of use, like our masters are primarily corporates, where like we actually have to cater to the needs, the security needs of the company that is actually our customer, right? So so the channel itself is like approximately 1 million users, spread over 54 countries. So it's a global application. It's not a like an in-country application. It's hosted like as a single instance, meaning like it's run from a single place, but like it's available in 54 countries or 50 plus countries. It includes a lot of it's more like a platform, and so it includes a lot of other features. Lots of SSO applications running off of this as well. One of the new things that are coming up, like new things that are coming up are open banking and PSD. PSD, if anybody is aware, the European, payment security, the Payment Services Directive, that is being put out. Actually, comes into effect in September 2019 in Europe, and there's like a whole bunch of so all banks in Europe are supposed to expose their functionality through APIs, and any fintech can actually use that. So like if I can I can register a fintech, like or a company, and then say and there are some requirements for what that is, like so. And once I register that company, I can basically use the APIs provided by the banks to make like basically provide a user interface to the to the customers, and have them access the banking application through my application. Right, so they don't actually have to ever go once they set it up. They don't ever have to go back to the bank anymore. They just go all the way through my application, right? So or the fintech or whatever like the company is. They typically called TPPs, third-party payment providers. It's again, if you split it into AISP, account information service provider, so where you only do read only, you just look at accounts, and then payment instruction service provider, PISP, where you can actually make payments as well. So there are lots of other stuff. Open banking is the UK initiative. It's primarily for UK. Like again, same thing, same concept. Open, like you need to expose APIs. Banks need to expose APIs, and then customers can use it through other interfaces. So just to keep that in mind, right? So I don't know, like how many people here work for a financial institution. So like financial institutions are typically regulated, heavily regulated. So we can't just do stuff because we want to do stuff. Like it has to meet regulatory requirements. So just because of the fact that we are like this platform is is in 54 countries, we have to comply with like regulatory requirements in all these countries as well. So it's not an easy job, because sometimes the regulations actually can be contradictory as well. So it's basically a question of which regulator you want to piss off, and what you can afford to piss, who you can afford to piss off. That's like sometimes what happens. So just the main point I wanted to talk about is the customer versus user difference, which is, our customers are actually companies, and then users will be the individual users working for those companies primarily. So, some of the formatting is actually gone. The I don't know, probably the computer or operating system, whatever it is. So what do we want to do? What are we trying to do here, right? So one of the things, like my goal, like, or at least the goal for this, the topic would be, like identifying users, accurately. Also identifying transactions accurately, and I'll talk about why, why I include this. When we talk about the attack vectors and stuff, like I'll come to why that is important. Usually what happens is we are only primarily focused on, like identifying the user once, like at the beginning of the session, and then after that, we don't, like really, we assume that the session is valid as long as somebody gives us a token, which is basically a session ID, or it could be something else, like a access token, some access token. So the bad would be, like what happens if it gets, like your application gets accessed by unauthorized users. So, they could bypass, and we will talk about how, that can happen, how, unauthorized users can access it. Most people already know this, but, we'll go through it again. Creation of unauthorized transactions, like could be the consequence of it. Like so if somebody, like if there is unauthorized access, somebody can actually create transactions, can actually just view information. That actually can cause lots of issues. There are, privacy regulations, like GDPR and all sorts of stuff where, like just loss of information itself is a problem. Like a bank, a nameless bank, just had to, submit to the California regulator that, like they, like unauthorized people accessed their customers' accounts, right? So, and because we are also heavily regulated, like we have to actually report everything, any breach, anything, like we have to report. The ugly would be, like the consequences of what these, like of these actions would be financial loss, reputation loss, and regulatory scrutiny. And regulatory scrutiny you don't want to have. You want to avoid as much as possible because, like once they get in, it's going to be really intrusive. And reputational hit, like obvious financial loss, obvious financial regulatory scrutiny can also result in extra financial loss because of the fact that, like they can actually fine you. And also, keep you, monitor you over time, and that actually can cost you money as well. And then you lose the ability to actually do things, like the freedom to actually do certain things, like so you'll have to do what they ask you to do, and you don't have a choice. And the deadline will suddenly shrink. Like they basically will give you, like less, flexibility in terms of, normally you could have basically said, hey, can I just comply with this a little later? Now, that's going to actually shrink, and, like the answers are probably going to be more no's than yeses, right? So you want to avoid that as much as possible. So typical authentication methods, right? So like we talk about, and I've just used a couple of them here, but they, like any access token, single sign federated access tokens, whatever it is, right? So primarily you're talking about username, password, like SCA. SCA is a PSD term, strong customer authentication, and strong customer authentication typically means you use multi-factor authentication, 2 out of 3, and 2 out of 3, the 3 would be possession, inherence, and knowledge. The knowledge would be your password, as an example. Inherence would be a biometrics, so like fingerprint, voice, like retina scan, heartbeat, whatever. And then your possession would be, like a secure token, or a, and like there is a reason, some people might recognize this, like there is a reason why I put this number, this calculator here. The platform that we support actually uses, a similar one, but it's not like the RSA token, it's like more like a for why you have the keypad. There is something called dynamic linking, which we'll talk about down the line as well. For transaction authentication, we use, you can actually enter data into this and then generate an OTP value based on the data that you enter. So that's why you have the, the calculator keyboard, right? So typically what you would have, like in any application, and one of the things that in normal best practice would be, like so you do re-authentication for sensitive operations, but you can also actually have, higher level of authentication for sensitive operations. So low risk account is if I'm just to look at accounts, like I'm okay probably with just using a username, password, or any access token. But if I want to make payments, and just to give you a like a view of like what the platforms that I'm talking about, like so billion-dollar payments, like can happen. So like there were like probably last year there were probably over 650,000 payments over $1 million. So the scale, the amount that we are talking about is huge. For a retail banking platform, typically your maximum will be like 99999. Like just $1 less than 100,000. Like we do like 18 nines or something like that. It's like an unbelievable number. I've never even seen that number fully written out. It's like a so it's a huge number, some hundreds of trillions of dollars. So the values are huge. So you want to make sure that like you're not going to allow just access like to make $1 million payment even using a password and like just a user ID and a password. Then you want to use an enhanced authentication method. One would be OTP. It's transaction signing. Transaction signing would be you enter, let's say, some part of the the PSD actually requires you to enter the value, the amount into the device or as part of the generation of the OTP. So you need to enter that into the device, and then it generates a value based on the value that you enter, and then that you use in your application as a OTP value. The problem for us is for retail banking this is fine, but for us like if you're talking about $1 billion payment, by the time you enter the number of like the digits, you're probably lost track of it, and sometimes like some of they only display 8 characters. And the problem with that is we are already over 8 characters, which means once it scrolls, you don't know what you typed and like where you are, and if it's like zeros consecutively, you're screwed. You're always going to make a mistake, right? So this is not going to work in a lot of cases. So what else can we do? How else can we like for critical high value payments or risky operations? It could even be just user management, and the application need not even be a financial application. Let's say it's like an application that gives you access to the electrical grid, right? How do I ensure that like I make sure that like somebody like I do enhanced authentication, and I also want to make sure that like there is physical possession of that OTP device. Let's say you use a security token that keeps generating time-based OTP. So you have a time-based OTP and an event-based OTP. Event-based OTP is where you click something or enter something and then generate a OTP value. Time-based is like it just keeps generating every 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a new value, and then you enter it. So even though that is like slightly, higher, strength, you take the OTP, like if somebody gets access to that time-based OTP device, and that basically means they possess the authentication token, and if they are able to get your password or credentials, the user ID password knowledge-based credential, then they are in. So what can we do, right? So we'll talk about some of the attack vectors and how like these will relate to some of the things that we want to do down the line, right? So presentation of a credential is really not sufficient proof that the actual person is the one logging in. So I can basically steal your credentials. Now, how does it happen? Credential stuffing attacks. You have seen. Like 3-4 days ago, there was this article about 738 million email IDs and passwords that got dumped from somewhere. LinkedIn has been hit. Twitter has been hit. Facebook has been hit. Like so all these companies have been hit. Where like somebody goes and like grabs. Even if not just this particular attack. Like lots of companies have actually lost credentials because they didn't store the credentials properly, user ID, password, like they didn't hash the password properly, they didn't solve the passwords properly, which meant they were vulnerable to a brute force attack or a rainbow table attack. So some form or the other, like stored credentials, you are going to basically get access to, and then even if your application, like our application need not be even, hacked, or our infrastructure need not even be hacked. They go somewhere else, they steal the data, the credentials from somewhere else, and then try it on us. And if some user has used the same credential in that application and our application gets compromised as well, because an unauthorized access has taken place. Now we have to report unauthorized data exposure, like to the regulator, and then we probably will be under scrutiny as well for various other reasons. But like so one of the things like it could be that is basically credential stuffing. You steal information from other websites and then try it out on this website. Weak credentials. The credentials themselves may be weak. Like sometimes like they use weak passwords. They sometimes like some of the applications may only allow like 5 character, 4 character, whatever it is. So it may be vulnerable to brute force attacks. Phishing. So another form of attack would be phishing, and phishing actually leads to 2 different two different variations on the attack. First one would be I can just pop up a window in a phishing attack to ask for credentials, and then you can provide the credentials, and then I use that in the application. So typically, like when it basically started off as, popping up a screen that looked like your bank, and you think that, oh, you're doing something, and suddenly screen pops up and then you enter it, and usually, like they send you emails, you click on a link and then it looks like your bank link, like you go in and you enter something and then, actually find out that, it's not really, they've stolen your credentials. The other way that happens is like, phishing emails could be spear phishing sent to a targeted person, or, like just a random spam email that actually you click on, installs malware on your device, and the malware on the device actually now does two different things, which is, one is it can actually intercept, it can basically run a proxy on your device. So let's say you run it, like you download, the malware gets downloaded on your computer. It can install keyloggers, it can install certificates in your trusted certificate store, and that has another complication, which is session hijacking, and I'll explain like how that can happen. So once malware comes on, it can basically pop up screens, just ask for credentials and people give credentials out. It could also be that it's just looking for specific sites that it's targeting. We've seen examples, we've actually seen real life examples attacking our institution. Like, so if like we had the vendor re-engineer the code, look at it, and the reverse engineer code, look at it, and then there is like specific something.com. And there is like a bunch of somethings.com. They are targeting, they are writing code to target specific applications or sites. And what happens also is, so when you target it, like, so what they're looking for is like they're looking at any access to those sites, and then the moment that happens, they activate. Until then, they just remain silent. So and then they can one is they can pop up windows to actually capture credentials. The other one is like they just look at it, sit quietly underneath, and then capture the credentials. The other thing we have seen, like on our side is like, like the malware actually pops up a screen when we do, multi-factor authentication with OTP. It actually asks for, instructs the user to actually press this button to do this, because they have already analyzed the, the banking software and the operational procedures that go with it. So they actually instruct the user to say, what, do this, click on this button to actually generate the code, put this in, enter this, and then they think that users thinks that it looks like exactly the same application. They basically skin it, and you can actually and the customers enter the data, and then that basically gets proxied back to, so the attacker will have a separate session, the user will have a separate session here, and then once you enter the credentials or whatever, the malware will basically say, please wait, and then it will do the operation on the back end. Or you can basically say, what, the application is not working, try again later. And so you are basically sitting back while the guy is actually now taking over your credentials and then reposting them, and then now having a session open in your name. From an application owner point of view, how do we know? Because all we know is like if somebody presented credentials that were valid, so user ID, password, or OTP value that actually matched, which makes it like perfectly valid login from my side, and we just basically start allowing you to do transactions or whatever, account information, whatever it is you want to do. Session hijacking, slightly like variation, like which is how does it happen? So your question might be, does the website not have HTTPS? Will the certificate not pop up as invalid? Because I'm doing a proxy in between. If anybody's used Burp Suite or any other interception, like a testing tool, you will see that like when you run it, like it'll actually pop up like a window, because of the fact that the browser to the proxy server is one session, and then the proxy server to the server is another session, and the browser only sees this proxy server's certificate, not the server's certificate. But I can actually, if I have access to the box, access to the computer, the user's computer, I can actually install a certificate on the device, regardless of its mobile or like it's a computer. I can install a certificate on the device, and I can now, like there is no warning anymore, right? So that is, and again, like the session token, the session is basically primarily dependent on the session token. So as long as I have, as long as I present a valid session token, like it's, I'm logged in. So you can log in, and I can basically capture your session, and I can start replaying it. The application has no clue, right? So some applications basically look for source IPs and stuff, but again, like based on, again, how many applications really do that? So the only thing is like, as long as somebody presents a valid token, I'm good. Social engineering. So one of the suggestions that were made, that was made, at least I researched a lot of this on, one of the suggestions was YubiKey. So can we use YubiKey? So there was like bunch of articles that came out recently, like a couple of months ago, where they said, oh, Google has done a lot of research on this and they have come up with this, and their attack rate has gone down drastically. The problem for us is, we are not dealing with Google engineers, knowing what to do, what to press, what not to press. We are talking about customers who have no clue a lot of the times about technology. They are just worried about, making payments. They are worried about, using the application, and they don't know about the, how, when to press, the YubiKeys button to authorize a transaction or not. We actually had a smart card, so you actually have a smart card reader attached to your computer. You put in a smart card and you put in a PIN, and then you actually authorize transactions or log in or whatever. And social engineering, I just call and say, hey, I see a problem, whatever, you need to put that in, put that in, they'll put that in, they'll listen to the attacker more than they listen to us, right? So again, it's all skill, how can I convince you to do something that I don't want, I want you to do, right? And with the right hooks, people will actually do it. So YubiKey for us, really not, and it's also expensive. I can't, for a million users, if I start sending out in 54 countries, by the way, regulation, we talked about regulation earlier. China has a cybersecurity requirement where they say that they have to use their encryption algorithm and their locally manufactured encryption chip, or the chip that is used in an OTP token. So we actually had to create one just for them. And why? I don't know. So I have some ideas on why, but that's they want it done that way. And if you want to do business there, you have to follow their rules, and that's the only way to do it, right? So and it's logistically it's a crazy it's a pain. Right, so you want to avoid as many devices and extra that we will actually end up paying for. You want to do that, and also if something happens, the battery dies out, and then they call help desk. So you actually have additional costs to it, in terms of support. So these are different. Any questions up to this point? I just wanted to make sure I just don't keep running. I want to. You feel free to raise your hand, whatever, so I can spot you. Ask any questions at any point of time. So drawbacks, we already talked about some of the stuff, depends on the presentation of valid credentials. It's a very rigid authentication journey. So one of the things that you'll end up doing is for us, at least in one of the platforms, if you make a payment, regardless of whether it's a $5 payment or $1 million payment, you have to do OTP. There is no other option. You can, write rules within your application to say, over this amount, do OTP, or over this amount, do some other form of authentication or extra form of authentication. But it's still rigid. You have a very rigid structure of, user journey for how, when authentication is going to kick in, what is going to happen. And again, you're limited by the number of, authentication methods that you can put in. Does not adapt to application usage risk. What are we talking about? We're talking about the existing legacy authentication mechanisms. It does not. So why? So if let's say I'm making payments to Farshad, I don't see Farshad. Okay, so I'll take Steven here. So I make payments to Steven every month. For he's blackmailing me for whatever, right? So so I make regular payments to him. So in this particular case, so if I'm just going to make a payment to Steven and I see, you see that, I've been making these payments for last 2 years. Why is that? Is that a risky behavior? It's a known behavior, but the application is not going to bother about it. It's still going to ask you for extra authentication because it's not intelligent enough to actually see that this is a pattern that that is valid and nobody has complained about it. So it is okay. So it's still going to add that extra friction of adding that extra authentication for making a payment, which depending on what your application does. So some of the other things that we can start talking about. This is going to be a primary, this is the the crux of our talk right now. So I'm going to be talking about the different aspects of how we do it. What are the different kinds of authentication, and then we are going to tie them all in towards, how they can all be combined to come up with a, a better authentication system or a continuous authentication system. So device context. So what is device context? So simplest device context would be your device fingerprint. So device fingerprint, So device context can be like also, like whether it's like if it's you're talking about a mobile device, you can be jailbroken, rooted, what device you are using, is it like a laptop, is it like a Android device, iOS device. Device fingerprinting will also include a lot of other stuff, which is, what's your screen resolution, is there a device ID that is provided by the device itself, like mobile devices do. It can also be, so it typically will look at time zone, screen resolution, fonts that you have put in the software on the device, any updates, versions, like of the updates, software running on top of, like the OS level. And all those other things, right? It also can use, IPs, IP addresses, like and locations. It could be, like geolocation, from your mobile device. So this would all be device fingerprint. So one of the reason I actually highlighted that device fingerprint was to, like a reminder for me to talk about this. When we did, when we evaluated vendors for device fingerprinting is not simple as like, just generate a unique hash for, like take a bunch of stuff and generate a unique hash. There is an algorithm to it, like a lot of companies actually, that is their bread and butter, like so we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we just go with the vendor. One of the things that we found out was, and Alex over there in the back, like was the guy that actually crunched the numbers. One of the things that we found was a lot of these vendors, like claim, high percentage, like, so you have two, like two measuring units that you would look at. One would be collision, the other one would be persistence. So like, like so for example, if you remove a font, your device fingerprint will change. So that basically means less persistence, right? So how long does a device fingerprint stay on as the same? And the collision would be how many people have the same device ID. So one of the things that, like, Stephen and I may have the same device ID, even though we are in completely different geographical locations. What you want is like low collision, which means you need to have unique devices, and high persistence, which means this device fingerprint should stay the same over a long period of time, which is how you can actually make sure that the device is unique, and you can map the device to the user, right? So one of the things that we found when we did POCs with vendors was everybody claimed like their product was the best, they can come up with like 99.999 reliability, whatever, right? We found out that like our situation was unique. This is where the difference between corporate and retail comes into play. Corporate, like so when you go to a company, your company probably has like images that you roll out onto PCs. So a lot of the pieces that you buy in bulk as well. So you have the same PC, same resolution, same software versions, same patches and everything else, and suddenly your collisions are suddenly increasing because all the attributes that they're looking for are pretty much the same. Across multiple devices, and it's all within the same IP address, because if you're all going through the same gateway out to the internet from your location, and I have like 10 people from here making payments on my system, all of you are probably going to have like very close device IDs. There is going to be at least a few collisions. How do I now uniquely identify? So this is a problem that we had to overcome, where and this is where most of the vendors failed. Like so we had to actually figure out a vendor that actually worked. Like where their rate was really high. So just a pointer for you guys, if you are looking at it, like make sure that you actually do a POC and look at statistics on like how effective they are, before you actually go with them. So IP address location, again, IP addresses, the last mile problem, like so you don't know exactly like where they are. So you can go country, you can go city, you can go region. Actually, it gives you a lot of, if you do geolocation through IP addresses, it can give you a lot of information, but the more you drill down, the more inaccurate they become sometimes, right? So it's not always the case, but a lot of times they, like the accuracy falls as you go down and down, like to the street level, your accuracy is almost, like off, way off. So you need to, keep that in mind when you're looking at IP address location. However, like it is a good indicator for some cases, which we'll talk about down the line. Behavioral biometrics. So behavioral biometrics is another method that is like very common now. Like so a lot of vendors are actually coming out with it. So what they do look for is like typing cadence. So how fast you type. So when I type something, like I type should, I always type SHOUDL, and then I correct it, and then I do that correction every time, every single time, literally. So that's a unique fingerprint for me. So there are lots of like mistakes that people constantly do, and those will become your fingerprint. Right, so as a unique identifier for you, how you hold the device. So if you're left-handed, right-handed, like, and how hard you type, like on a mobile device, for example. So how quickly do you move your mouse over the, like over the screen. So if you are very familiar with the application, you go tuck 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 tuck. Not, like you're probably going to, like look for stuff, you're going to be slow. And you also have heat maps, like, so, everybody knows heat maps. So, like you'll see, where people go the most, and each person has a unique signature or a unique pattern for, doing stuff on the screen. So all those they will learn, and then that becomes your fingerprint. So that becomes your unique ID. Okay, so the other thing that we talk about, I think, there is a little bit of stuff missing, I guess. Okay, so other thing that we can talk about is user behavior. So one of the things that we can normally we can look at, is other than the biometric stuff, is what is your normal, right? So we'll talk about normal down the line, but like, so you will normally make payments of let's say 100,000 to 200,000, or like in a retail banking scenario, you're probably going to look at like let's say $100 to $500 normally. Most of your transactions are going to be in that range. So who do you make payments to normally? So you're probably going to make payments to your bills, like your electricity company, your cable company, blah blah blah, right? So those are, or like a couple of friends, like like I'm paying blackmail to Steven, like, so I keep making those $100 payments or whatever it is that I make. So that could be your like known beneficiaries, right? Time of day. So in our situation, this is also different. In our situation, most people come to work. In a corporate scenario, people come to work, and because they are operating on company accounts, they come to work, and then it's like usually a 9 to 5 or like whatever time zone, whatever time they normally work in. So if you see anything like we'll talk about anomaly detection a little bit, but like, so these are things that we normally see. So one of the things that you will do is like if you're our customers, our users normally make like they come into work, let's say 100 payments a day. So they come in, they know exactly what the position is, like they go in, they make a payment, they go out. So your user journey can also be your unique identifier. It's not going to be 100% unique. It's a reliable, it can be a reliable indicator depending on what you're looking for. So one of the things that we have seen, like is that, like some of the fraudster sessions are usually longer. The session, the interval itself is longer than normal users. So that could be actually, informing you on your risk as well. So these are different things that you can look for, that you don't actually have to ask the user to do anything. It's all, you're looking at existing information. You're not looking at new information. You're not asking the user to enter anything. So this is basically less friction for the user, and you're also going to ask for extra authentication or whatever depending on the risk, like the risk that you see for a particular activity. That's where like the continuous and the adaptive authentication, or yes, go ahead.
So first of all, are there tools that you know of to obfuscate the behavioral biometrics?
The simplest tool would be disable JavaScript. Sorry.
Having questions from the audience, please ask for a microphone so our people who are watching could also hear the question.
Yeah. So the question was, I'll just repeat this question here. So is there a way to actually disable behavioral biometrics, like, or at least obfuscate behavioral biometrics? Can happen, like, so the easiest way would be to just disable JavaScript. However, like a lot of applications, including Google just recently, requires you to enable JavaScript to actually work, like for you to use the service. So that would be one way of doing it, like, so the other way, so there are, so I don't want to go into too much detail in terms of, like how to attack. So this is not a course, and this is not a, like a talk on how to attack behavioral biometrics. So like, yes, it can be done. So I could replay. So again, does the vendor that you use have replay protection? So there is like a lot of other things that you need to look for when you look for, look at a vendor, or if you are going to develop it yourself as well. So the answer is yes, like to the question in some cases, but I can choose to just say, what, I'm not going to allow, like if you're, if you disable JavaScript, I'm not going to allow you to use the application. And nowadays, like more and more applications actually require JavaScript to do, like because everything happens on the screen, right? Like, so it's all the magic happens with like very little, back-end interaction. Okay, so let's move on. Yes, go ahead.
So, with regards to the anomaly detection, I know you haven't spoken to that yet,
Yeah.
but, you know, you're talking about the user behavior, so it's New Year's Day and they've got a hangover, or it's the day after their birthday. What type of elasticity do you have or allow for to not have the, have
Yeah, I
triggers
understand.
occur?
So this is something that you have to consider. Again, it depends on the elasticity that going to depend on your use case. You know, so the more critical the use case, you know, like, or more sensitive the use case, the less elasticity you want to, you know, like, allow. Lot of the so again, you know, like, so this is, like I said, you know, like, this is just one method of authentication that you want to use. So you don't want to depend on this 100%. So what happens? So anomaly, right? So we talk about anomaly detection down the line. What if this is an anomaly? Let's say you're hungover and you're not, you know, like, you're not doing the things the way you normally do. So this is going to be an anomaly. So how do you account for this in your application? So your vendor, you know, like, or whatever, you know, if you use a vendor, you know, like, that algorithm itself should have, you know, allowed for something, but then even if that comes up as a you know, like, not matching, you know, the pattern, what do you do about it is something that you need to come up with as a use case for, you know, that would be an anomaly. So we'll talk about risk weighting anomalies down the line. So let's just move on and then we will cover that in just a minute. So there are a few other things that we can actually do as well. So configuration risk score is something, you know, like, you mentioned something. Wow, you know, like, did I run through really quick? Oh, okay. 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 So configuration risk score is something that, you know, like, we talk about, you know, like, in terms of how the application itself is configured for the user. So let's say, you know, in our platform we have dual control. You know, so dual control meaning maker checker controls. So, you know, like, even other applications can have it. Doesn't have to be a financial application. When you create a user, somebody else has to come and authorize the user. It could be like a payment approval, you know, like a expense approval application. Somebody creates it, somebody comes and approves it. So the more controls you have, you know, you can actually, and if the user is set up for those, you can actually reduce your risk level or at least weight the risk, you know, like, appropriately. So if I have dual control and if I set up limits, so for example, you know, on our platforms we allow, you know, people, users and customers to be set limits. So you as a person cannot make more than like $1 million payment, or, you know, let's say $100,000 payment, but the other user can actually make, you know, up to $1 million or even $10 million. So, you know, if you have set up limits, you know, for individual users according to your risk appetite, you can actually address that, you know, include that as part of your risk scoring, you know, like, for authentication. Okay, so if you are using a jailbroken rooted device, you know, like, so if you, and, you know, there are again tools to check for a jailbroken rooted device, which we use a vendor that actually reports into it. It looks at the when you start the application, it looks for, you know, like, whether it's jailbroken rooted, and then reports to us, and then we use that, you know, we can use that as part of our decisioning system. So inherently risky behavior, you know, like, using a jailbroken rooted device means that you have bypassed protections on the device, and that can actually, you can increase your risk score proportionately depending on how you see it and what kind of operations you perform. Fraud intelligence is another thing that, you know, like, I think Tanya also mentioned this, you know, Twitter, you know, like, and breach or whatever, right? So this is something that, you know, like, larger companies have, you know, we have it, where, you know, like, people look at, you know, go on the dark web, look at, you know, like, anything that actually talks about anybody they're talking about, you know, like, attacking the company, or, you know, like, exchanging exploits, you know, or credentials or whatever, and then that gets reported down to the security teams, and then we basically, you know, take action in terms of, you know, if it's a vulnerability that, you know, we are not aware of, you know, we try to fix it before anything can happen, or at least put, you know, like she was talking about WAF as a you know, intermediate control or an immediate control that you can put in place, kind of thing. We don't actually, you know, like, do it that way. However, you can handle it, right? So this can be discussions about sharing, like weaknesses, like sharing, credentials and stuff like that, like you want to look at, you can also use that. So one of the things that I would talk about, the way I would do this would be, if I see that there is a, like there is a imminent attack or an indication of attack or a discussion around attacks against a platform, I would basically increase my risk threshold or my risk threshold, or rather lower my risk threshold, which means more users will probably have to go through extra authentication steps, at least for a time period, and that basically protects me for a while, right? So while that that threat goes away. So there are things that you can do with fraud as well. So the next thing, so we want to talk about is anomaly detection. So what you need is a normal. So what you need to do is identify what is normal for a user. So let's say I make payments to like Steven, like every month $100 or whatever, $1,000, and that would my normal. And when do I make the payments? Like time of day, behavioral biometrics, like in terms of I log in, like, and this is the way I type. And also transactional value range, so it's like I always make payments to Steven on during this time or in this date range. Also from IPs, where are my IP locations? Like so if I'm always logged in from Vancouver into the application, and suddenly you see the anomaly would be if I suddenly travel to New York or somewhere else and then started using the application, that would be an anomaly that you would flag, and you weight the risk score and then flag. So you also have to have a threshold, like so let's say like every like time of day, like that would be like if there is an anomaly, you basically flag it at like 10 units. And then if behavioral biometrics that you raised a question on, you raise that to like, let's say you assign another 10, a value of 10 to it. So if that is an anomaly, let's say that scores 0 now, because like you cannot rely on it anymore because or it's false. So you cannot just look at that alone as an individual piece, because you are now looking at it as in a holistic way with other things. So is the time of day okay? Is the location okay? Are you making a payment to a like a known beneficiary that you have already made lots of payments to? So usually fraud will happen with like new beneficiaries. So like I'm trying to divert funds to a new person. So that, or to the fraudster, right? So if or if you're making a bill pay, like your electric company, right? If you're making a bill pay to the electric company, you can always get the money back, even if you make a mistaken payment. I've done that multiple times. I always select the first one, or I don't actually select anything. I just make a payment, and then I realize that like it's always defaulting to the first, like BC Hydro, because it starts with B, and then like I was actually $1,000 in credit, like with them, because I didn't actually look at the confirmation page. I just kept making payments, and then all the other guys started complaining. Hey, like they were sending me notices to cut my connection, whatever, right? So I had to call them and like say, okay, get the money back, send the money back in here. So would be a normal. So anything that is anomalous to this, like I'm just using some examples here. So like so some of the authentication points as examples, but anything that is anomaly would be flagged and then weighted, and then that would be once it reaches a threshold. So let's say like each one is assigned like 10, and then in here we have 5, let's say, and then like your score is 50, or like let's say anything over 50 is going to be you can choose to do a lot of things. You can basically say, what, I'm going to kick you out of the session. I don't like a lot of things I'm seeing here. Or I can say, what, I'm going to limit your payment values. So like so let's say your normal limit is like 100,000. I'm going to limit you to $10,000. So, and that can be dynamic. It doesn't actually have to be set up somewhere. You just have to so based on the policy, we'll talk about policy engine down the line, but like based on all these things that we see, I can at runtime, without actually having any like hard coding anywhere, I can actually reduce the limit to a value that I'm comfortable with. Like so if I have to pay out, let's say if it turns out to be fraud, and I have to pay you back, reimburse the customer, I don't want to reimburse $100,000. I would rather reimburse just the $10,000, but at the same time, I'm not blocking you from making payments. I'm actually allowing you, so less friction. I'm actually allowing you to make payments, except that now like you have a reduced functionality. I think Tanya mentioned earlier as well, reducing functionality. So you can reduce functionality without actually blocking functionality. So that would be your, like so, and the key is going to be creating the profile, right? So like I just talked about this as well. So every anomaly gets a weighted score. The key here is like, constantly fine tuning. And one of the things, I don't know if everybody has heard about this, which is the Microsoft chatbot basically got, trained to, spew profanity constantly, right? So, this is where, like you got to be very careful about, like training. And a lot of times, attackers, it's a cat and mouse game, constant cat and mouse game, where, like somebody is actually trying to, like bypass your controls, and you're trying to put in more controls to, overcome their attacks. And at the same time, you're also trying to make sure that, like there is, like not too much friction for the customer, and you want the customers to use your application. Again, you don't want to make it the more secure by just basically blocking off all functionality. Go ahead. Sorry, get them.
Implementing some sort of objective mechanism, like the system itself can be biased, right, based on these normals, right? So have you ever considered implementing some sort of third-party, like Oracle-based service?
So, so the so I don't want to get into vendor specific, like so when you say Oracle.
Oracle is an entity that's tied to the real world, that's using that as metrics to provide information to other systems, so it has less of a bias.
Okay, so you're basically talking about, so yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, so this is the thing, right? So I don't want to, build anything on my own, like I typically tend to use actually vendor products to actually do this. And you want to make sure that, you don't want to bias it, but at the same time, you also, like we, in our platform, we actually know more about the customer and how the customers use it than a third party. So you want to, it's up to you, like at that point, but like you know your customer best, you know your patterns of the customer best, what they use, how they use it, and I would suggest that you use that. But if you look at, like behavioral biometrics as an example, like they probably have better models of, like how, after a hangover, what is the tolerance limit for a, like the user to, type, the typing speed cadence and everything else. I don't want to reinvent the wheel, exactly the point. So in those cases, I would actually use the vendor's, product to actually, like provide that tolerance. But then from a platform specific, like user behavior perspective, I would use my model. Right? So you are not going to, use, you don't want to depend completely on vendors, you don't want to depend completely on yours as well. So you want to have a mix of both. Right? So one of the other things that we see is like distraction attacks. So so when there is a so typically there's a brute force attack or a DDoS like on our platform when they are attempting fraud or trying to impersonate another user, trying to like do a credential stuffing attack or trying to take over an account and then impersonate the actual user. So you want to like look for so one of the things with the threshold would be, I talked about this already, which is if I have a 50 as the normal as the threshold, if I see that there is a DDoS attack happening on our network, I can basically lower the threshold to, or rather I can, like in this case, raise it. So that means you have to pass 60 to be able to, get in, right? So I can do, like I have the flexibility of adding, adjusting the threshold up or down depending on in the situation. So I call this situational awareness, right? So you want to see, you want to fine tune your system based on what the situation that is happening around you. So two key components that are required. One would be the policy engine. The policy engine is basically going to apply the rules, right? So for example, I want to say, if you see this, if the payment value is like this, or if the behavioral biometrics is like not checking out, what do you want to do? And that is going to be your policy engine that is going to apply that rule. Okay, so what, I'm going to ask for a second factor authentication or a different factor authentication, or step the user up from, like, maybe the user just logged in with a user ID and password. Now I want to actually do a push notification to to their mobile device to actually have them authenticate and approve a transaction, or even just get re-authenticated. So that is going to be your policy engine, and that is going to require input from all the sensors on the current risk and the values that you see to come in. It also maintains authentication state, which is so you logged in at as a user ID password user, and now that is going to maintain that. And if you now need to, if you do a sensitive operation, it's going to step you up or just do a second factor authentication, and that it needs to know, because you don't want to keep for every operation, like let's say you do one payment and then it steps you up, and then next payment it doesn't need to step you up again. If it can maintain that state, if you just stepped up, you just did push authentication, you just authenticated to the system that it was you, and as long as no other parameter changes, I can still retain that same authentication level and use the previous authentication level to actually let you perform the next operation. So that again goes towards less friction. So yes, there is an increased one level of friction that goes up, but then you can just maintain that at that point. You don't have to keep, for every operation, you don't have to keep authenticating the user. The profile engine, which is what we talked about just now, which is the how do you keep your normal current? So how long do you look at? For example, if I looked at like 3 years worth of data for a corporate, the business could have grown, the number of users could have expanded, the users could have gone away. So like how do I know that how do I keep that normal current? So you want to look at like somewhere between 3 to 6 months of data for a particular user, and the key is going to be accessing that information real time. As users interact with your application, you need to actually be able to pull up that information and get the risk score really quickly for you to apply the policy that you have in the policy engine, right? So, and the bad normal, we talked about the chat bot, which is like, you can actually have, like attackers do this all the time. Go ahead. Sorry, I think you need the microphone.
Instead of like location IP.
So it depends, right? So depending on what you do, how you do. So the device ID typically are going to be run from a browser. So it's all going to be in anything that is available within the browser is all you're going to get primarily, at least for us, like in our case, it's going to be like, primarily desktop application. So you're going to basically have anything that is available within a browser. It's not a thick client, it's basically a thin client. With mobile devices, you may actually have access to some of the extra information. Yes, then you will use it. So the vendors, you need to check with the vendors, when you do your POCs or, when you're talking to them, depending on which device or which, media, channel you're going to be using, you want to check what are all the, what they use. They're not going to ever tell you everything that they're going to use, because that's their secret sauce. They're not going to tell you, but at least you can ask them, specific questions, and they will usually answer you. So yeah, hope that answers your question, right? Okay.
So are you regionalizing that data? You talked about 54 different countries, so I/O is a huge issue here with. Sorry, are you regionalizing the data because you got 54 different countries, so I/O is a massive issue here, latency is a massive issue here with regards to the user experience. If it's got to query the AI engine or whatever the hell you're calling it, you need to regionalize that.
So data. this is a problem that you need to solve. So how do you get, and that is something that is like very critical. So like again, for us it's like different. It's not going to be 54 countries all logged on at the same time, because it's time zones. So you have like like up and down, so you're at the most like in a single time zone or a couple of time zones overlapping are going to be using it. So you're not going to have all the users logged in all at the same time. So you do have that cadence, like that you can actually work with. So it's also like how you cache, where you cache. So I'm not going to go into the technical details. This topic is not about the technical details of how you actually implement it. It's basically the concepts of using continuous and adaptive authentication to actually reduce friction for customers and also increase security, right? So we can have that discussion. That's a separate, altogether separate discussion. How you cache the information, how do you pull that? Like how do you, the normal needs to be constantly pulled. How do you keep that, right? So again, like you're not going to be, so you're not, yeah. So we address it, like in a specific way, where we actually have agreements with, individual countries to, locate it in certain places. So there are ways to deal with that as well. But yeah, I mean that's not the, like that's a different conversation. Just handling regulatory issues is a completely, like a day, probably more, like topic, right? So again, like coming to the close of like the talk. Basically, I'm open to questions, like probably at this point, but I'm gonna just talk about like there are different forms of authentication. So it's not about like using fingerprint or voice or heartbeat or retina or whatever. It is how you bring them seamlessly together with less friction for the user, but at the same time increasing your security. So what happened? Sorry? Oh, TV went to sleep. Okay, anyway, I think we are kind of close. Anyways, just like 4 or 5 points that I want to make before I close. Sorry? Yeah, it basically said, keep your mouth shut now, stop, right? So that's okay. So understand the risks. So like I was talking about it from a corporate banking, like financial institution point of view. Your situation might be completely different, but at least like the concept you should be able to take and adapt to your needs. The risks you may have are different probably. If you are using health information, is going to be different. You have different set of requirements, regulatory requirements, privacy requirements that need to be met. Also, the sensitivity of data is slightly different. So you want to address those like in your way. Again, do not assume that somebody supplying a valid credential is actually the valid user. May not be. Check, so when you say continuous authentication, you're not checking in every page, because that's going to cause the problem of, like, so how many times do you go and check, the authenticity of the user? You want to do it at least in, just before sensitive operations, you perform sensitive operations, you want to check, the authenticity. And then keep normal profiles current. So again, that takes a lot of effort and background effort, but that is something that is very critical, because if your normal is not okay, you are not going to detect anomalies, because everything is going to basically get screwed up. And then so this is one more big issue that normally people don't talk about, which is like people get used to doing certain things certain ways. So if I expect a pop-up, extra pop-up, like on this particular page, I'm looking for it. Like even subconsciously, I'm looking for it. And with adaptive authentication, in some cases, what can happen is you can pop up windows, authentication challenges in unexpected places, depending on what they are trying to do. What can end up happening is, we have seen this. I talked about this a little bit, at the beginning. Users, when they are presented with a malicious actor popping up a window, they'll answer the question. So what you may be doing with your adaptive authentication is that you can actually be habituating the user to respond to a challenge quickly, without thinking much. So you want to be careful about you need to use this judicially. You can't just randomly start throwing authentication challenges everywhere, but you want to, and you don't want to, you want to keep the user journey as consistent as possible. So you want to do it in sensitive places that you want to authenticate the user before you perform an operation. So that would be the end of it. So the TV's already went off. So I'll close. Any questions? Open to questions now. Yes.
How do you quantify the value of the work that you do in terms of like the risk reduction? So like, I mean, are you really able to, I mean, the number of transactions that you must process is unfathomable, but like to say like breach is avoided, for example, to support that investment in the work that you do?
So you have current state, like, or you basically have your previous state, like, which is like, you didn't have this, like how many, like instances of fraud and why those frauds happen, or, unauthorized access. It could just be unauthorized, doesn't have to involve payments at all, just unauthorized access. Why did that happen? How did that happen? It could be like, we track whether it was through social engineering, whether it was through malware on the device, whether it was through, phishing attack. So we track all those things, and then we can basically see. So I didn't go into, like malware. So I didn't go into too much detail about malware. So one of the things that we actually do is like also look for malware on the browser. So when you see that, and you see that, like the user, you automatically reduce the thresholds, like you can actually, those activities where you apply a policy engine, apply the policy through a policy engine, you can actually audit that. Like, so every time, like you reduce the threshold, or every time you basically block access, or every time you ask for enhanced authentication, you can actually audit those, and you can then go back and review why that happened, that extra step or whatever you did, the action happened, and then you can use that to fine-tune your model, as well as you can use that to justify why you did what you did. Go ahead. Anything else? Okay.
Okay, if there are no questions, let's give Siva a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Siva.